Welcome back, everybody. It is now my pleasure to introduce Joanne Duclis from Duclis Cornerstone Consulting. I have worked with Joanne on a variety of projects over the years, both related to BC CAT work as well as provincial initiatives. She is a highly regarded speaker and knowledgeable on issues related to higher education and technology. And she's here to present on a topic that is near and dear to Rob Fleming at BC CAT's heart, micro-credentials. There usually is not a day that goes by where he doesn't get an email or some questions about micro-credentials. It's been a hot topic ever since we have moved into complete online delivery of education. And so Joanne's going to provide us with an overview of what's going on in the world of micro-credentials, and she'll be participating in the live Q&A shortly at the end of this presentation. So over to you, Joanne.
Thanks very much, Mike. Warm greetings, everyone. Really thrilled to be sharing my micro-credentialing research with our BC CAT 2020 JAM audience. We're going to be talking about some trends and implications today for transfer and admissions, and I'll be walking you through the research report as well as the findings, what the community is recommending for moving forward, and then we'll pause and head into some discussion. Without further ado, the research objectives were very clear. BC CAT asked me, through their research committee, to identify and review current and emerging practices in developing and accepting micro-credentials in admissions and transfer. The piece about admissions and transfer are very important, and you will notice that the findings speak specifically to this focus area, although I'll spend some time talking a little bit about broader context. The other piece that was a really important objective was to explore what are the motivations and some of the issues and opportunities for developing and using micro-credentials in this space, admissions and transfer. There was a component that asked me to look at employers and human resource staff perspectives. We feel strongly, based on the data, that more research is needed in this area. The last piece was to identify some future research opportunities and some recommendations from the community for moving forward, so I'll share those, and they're also included in the final report. In terms of this approach, we started first with the literature review and the environmental scan. We also conducted quite the website review, and the findings are embedded in the report in the various appendices, as well as woven in the whole content. Conducted a number of interviews, both in BC and across Canada and around the world with experts. We did a national bilingual survey that looked to explore what is going on, what the recommendations are, and what are some of the challenges and opportunities. And that resulted in the final research study, which will be published on the BC CAT website. In terms of the findings, there were many. I'd like to start first with the broad context setting for micro-credentials. I think it goes without saying that there has been tremendous change, and it's important to speak to that issue and that dynamic, because that is why we're even having these conversations about micro-credentials in the higher education space. So I'm sure many of you have heard of the wave of STEAM and all those kinds of different waves. The next wave of innovation that we've been in for quite some time is information and communication technology and networks. Well, there are some that are saying that, in fact, we're cusping to a new wave that is looking at sustainable innovation, sustainable interoperability, and so on. And so what that means is the rise of multidisciplinary experts and the importance of having people at the table that allow conversations and opportunities to work between the disciplines and to pollinate across the disciplines. And micro-credentials serve as an important symbol of expertise that is cross-cutting. And I'll explain what I mean by that a little bit later. The other thing I would ask you to keep in mind is at the very center, certainly of my work, and certainly of this research, is the learner, the person who has to go from point A to point B, either to another institution or beyond into the workplace. And how are micro-credentials enabling that admissions and transfer, if at all, and why bother that piece about access and mobility? So if you could hold on to some of this framing, you'll see some of what I'm talking about. And I also like to make it real. When you think about admissions and transfer assessment and a micro-credential arriving at the door of an institution, one question that comes to mind is, what technology helped to get it here? Is it official? The other piece is recognition, which gets to policy and purpose. Is the provider of the learning experience recognized? Is the learning experience recognized, credit or non-credit, for example? What's the policy at your institution regarding some of this? Is the credential from a trusted source? And did the credential come through a trusted channel? Is it a document that we have to worry about quality or document fraud because of that? So at each stage of these types of questions, there's kind of a binary decision that needs to be made when you're actually assessing the credential. And it's always yes, no. There could be a possibly, but it ultimately it goes one way or the other. The other piece that comes into this is practice. How does an institution assess a credential like this, or a transcript, or what have you, or the bundle that a learner brings to the door? Are they eligible for admission? Were they successful? Are they eligible for transfer credit? Is it related to the program of study? What kind of assessment occurred, etc.? So I'd ask you to hold on to this, because at the end of the day, we are talking about people who are submitting the micro-credential, but also the credential evaluators that are interpreting policy, purpose, practice, documents, etc., when it comes to that door of admissions or transfer credit. So from the research, one of the things that came through loud and clear is the dust has not settled on definitions. Dr. Oliver has a definition here, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. And I think one of the things that comes out, which is the point of the last bullet, is that there's quite a lot of variability and a lack of standardization. And what's the implications of that? Well, it presents problems for the learner, the institution, the employer, because it makes it difficult to assess and compare the different micro-credentials. And it doesn't have the same understanding as a master's degree, let's say, that arrives at a credential evaluator's door. So this is something that is weaving its way into the Canadian conversation. Dr. Oliver's definition for micro-credentials I quite liked, and you'll see an analysis in the report of the various definitions that are available out there to aid your next steps. Her definition talks about it being a certification of assessed learning that is additional, alternate, complementary to, or a formal component of a formal qualification. She talks about credit-bearing micro-credentials, including assessment that's aligned to a formal qualification level. For example, at the bachelor's level, the associate degree level, the master's level, the certificate level, etc. Achievement of learning outcomes that leads to an offer of admission to or credit towards at least a formal qualification, whether or not the learner takes up the offer. And credit-bearing micro-credentials mirror and contribute to the academic standards required in the target qualification, that associate degree, that bachelor's, etc. And the duration and effort required by the learner are in keeping with the amount of credit earned in the target qualification. So that is a piece that she talks about as well. Defining characteristics from analysis of the various research and from the definitions, there's this great debate around digitized versus non-digitized. I live in the world of data exchange and digitization and credential evaluation and international best practice. Digitization is not exclusive to micro-credentials. Transcripts, documents, diplomas, parchments, all manner of things in higher ed are being actively digitized. So micro-credentials no longer hold the mark on that. The pieces that are critically important in my mind are that it's officially verified by the issuer, that it's a formal certification of what a person knows and can do, that it's shareable, portable, user-controlled. That means the user decides who gets to see it and when, that it's relevant to the workplace, on demand, flexible, etc. So some of these descriptors we see a lot in the literature, and in the report we provide you with a summation of those. There is a very good adaptation of definition that we've placed in the report that talks about and builds off of the definition that Dr. Oliver provides, and that is noted here. The other thing that we noticed is that there are different models. So there's the concept of vertical stacking, where there's a very intentional combining of one credential with another to achieve a successfully higher credential. That's called a stackable credential. And then there's the concept of this horizontal stacking, which we often see in industry, where many credentials are pursued and they basically line up side by side. And then there's what I call complementary stacking. Some call it value-added stacking. In my mind, this is more organic. I'm a great example of the complementary credential stacking model. I did a Bachelor of Arts degree. I did a Master's in Business Administration. And then I've also been formally certified outside of the higher education realm through some very vigorous programs in human resources and psychometric assessment testing. There are other examples. A Bachelor of Arts student that I learned about that went on to do a college graduate diploma in PR, and then a specialized industry certificate to further augment their skills. So the world is changing, and this model's helped to emphasize that. In our research, both through the literature review, but also through the survey, we explored what type of learning is represented through a micro-credential. And these are some of the examples that are relevant to higher education. A subset of courses are studied within or alongside of a degree or diploma that's been subject to some kind of quality assurance vetting. Continuing education studies, including in partnership with industry, not always assessed for quality assurance in the traditional sense of the macro degrees of bachelor's, associate degrees, et cetera, or diplomas or certificates. Outside the classroom in organized programs, we often hear about things like co-curricular learning or informal learning experiences that perhaps are assessed, monitored, and credentialed through a micro-credential. And accommodations of any of the above, which depend on the policies and practices of the institutions and organizations involved. Assessment of prior learning sometimes also results in a micro-credential, which is very interesting as an opportunity through the process of building in and baking in micro-credentialing to support recognition of prior learning. There are some really interesting models that we encountered through our work. Thompson Rivers University has innovated worldwide by taking in micro courses that could build towards a terminal credential. Simon Fraser University is doing some really interesting work in their Fast Forward program with microcredit courses. The New Zealand Qualifications Authority, I'm going to talk about in a minute. It is a very interesting model at the system level that uses and builds on quality assurance frameworks and credential registries. The U.S. Credential Engine has innovated standards that are really important for helping to port what a type of credential is, not necessarily the student's knowledge and gains, but rather what that credential means and what level it situates at in the spectrum of credential confusion. Algonquin College has done some really interesting work to develop out a really solid institutional micro-credentials framework that people might want to take a look at. And SUNY in the U.S. has a really robust definition for micro-credentials that seems to have resonance in the higher education field. These and many more, both Canadian and international examples, are called out in the report to assist you as you're looking at the typology of options. The New Zealand Qualifications Authority is really quite interesting. They've adopted an approval framework for micro-credentials, which embeds them into existing qualification levels. So, for example, if you have a micro-credential that's at the master's level, it will be approved as such, and it will be part of their credential registry so that it can be recorded on things like the Learner's New Zealand Record of Achievement. That's very helpful to help credential evaluators to situate learning that has occurred that they might want to consider for admissions or transfer and not dismiss out of hand. Their criteria is it must offer 5 to 40 credits, be closely tied to industry, reviewed annually, not duplicate quality assured learning approved by the NZQA, and as I said, that it aligns to qualification levels both there and elsewhere. And as they're approved, they're put in this registry so that you can actually go online as a credential evaluator and say, yes, this one is a master's level, this many credits, I can see its comparability to the work that is here. That is the kind of thing that actually aids admissions and transfer, which is why I call it out. The Canadian context from our interviews as well as from our research and our survey is interesting. What we're seeing is growing interest. Practice is minimal in the use of micro-credentials in admissions and transfer. The quality, most are not subject to the same kind of QA as recognized credentials. And, if there are QA frameworks, they're not, at the time of this research, referencing micro-credentials, although I know there's lots of conversation. Select examples exist of transcription, and typically it's because perhaps a credit-bearing course within a micro-credential cluster is in fact transcripted. We asked for examples of transcripts. We received one, and it's referenced at the top of the record. Otherwise, there were none that were brought forward. There's lots of confusion around definitions and standards, and the motivations do vary, but interestingly, yes, we know about access to industry, but I'll show you some data where they're saying future studies is considered very important, and there are interesting models and innovators emerging. So of those that reported back, 1 out of 5 have a working definition for micro-credentials. 19 reported offering micro-credentials out of 90 surveyed. These are some of the actual schools that self-identified as doing so. And this deck will be available for you after the session. In terms of survey respondents, most came from BC and Ontario and Alberta, which are very populous countries, populous provinces. Quebec is a different kind of province because of their CEGEP model. It was institutional universities that responded in Quebec, but that gives you a bit of a flavor. Mostly universities responded, but also colleges and post-secondary institutions. Interestingly, colleges are most active in this space, as are polytechnics. So the other thesis source, most of these micro-credentials appear to be emanating from the continuing education areas, but they're also coming out of program areas. I was talking to one school, and I don't reference this in the report, but this is recent news. They actually have faculty members within their courses giving out close to 19,000 badges annually, which is extraordinary when you think about it, and a potentially lost opportunity from the point of view of admissions and certainly transfer. Most, they reported that an internal governing body would approve these micro-credentials, but lots of staff, lots of faculty. So it's variable. It's not like our typical credentials that are more tightly governed, shall we say. Some of the defining characteristics are not really surprising. Competency-based, shareable in electronic format, often represents time spent in classes, etc. There's some that are personalized, some that are not personalized, some that are available on demand, some that are not. So there's still obviously debate going on. And some even offer them in paper format, which is interesting. Again, those learning experiences, most reported that in fact it's representing learning from participation in continuing education programs or from a subset of courses or studies within a program. So again, some variability there. Motivations were fascinating, and believe it or not, the top one was providing access to further education. One would argue then that the notion of creating in the design phase a micro-credential that has thinking about admissions and transfer baked in at that design phase would be a priority given this motivation. But in fact, that isn't a driving motivator that we're seeing in the examples that most are talking about. Usually they're talking about workplace need. So again, there's a bit of a disconnect here and an opportunity. So when asked directly if they're using micro-credentials for admission and transfer, the jury is mixed. Most of it's no for admissions and no for transfer. Only 33% said they'd look at it for transfer. And this is the kind of credit they would award, such as course-specific, assigned credit, or no credit. This is just a splash of the data to give you a flavor that, again, there's some interesting variety there and some opportunities that might be missed. The other thing is one school did indicate that they give a minimum of 10 credit hours and a maximum of 30 credit hours, which is very interesting when you think about New Zealand and how they've approached things, and how Europe, in fact, is also looking at the space. The transcript sample that was provided, the micro-credentials are referenced at the top with the semester to which it was assigned and the date, and that's it. Another institution, when asked, actually didn't provide a transcript. They provided their credential framework, which was very helpful because it talked about how they situate the micro-credential and the kind of things that they're applying from a rigor point of view to make sure that they're following some kind of methodology. In terms of plans to adopt micro-credentials, 41% reported yes out of the 90 that participated. So there's lots of interest, but there's also lots of questions, because you can see 37% said not sure. So concluding thoughts, they're very new. An opportunity exists to more closely align intentions for the use of micro-credentials with opportunities for improving transfer and admission. So remember what I said about the motivator, to improve access to studies being the top motivator. That comes to our third bullet here, which says, think about embedding a focus on admissions and transfer intentionally into the design and framework of these micro-credentials, because that will be helpful to learners to advance access to higher ed. So moving forward, interestingly enough, we found all manner of recommendations, establishing shared definitions that fit the purpose, aligning micro-credentials with existing quality assurance processes and contexts where that makes sense, creating a credential registry, building partnerships with industry, aligning these with existing prior learning processes to aid RPL through admissions, and creating and supporting communities of practice like BC-CAT Jam today to encourage discussion and innovation. There were so many suggestions for implementation provided by the communities and by the research. So the report includes a suggested implementation checklist that covers a myriad of topics from purpose all the way down to learner access. Purpose is the most foundational, and it cuts back to that motivation piece. What are the underlying motivations for creating the micro-credential? And if there is a possibility of access to future education, which should always probably be one of the motivators, this tells you what you need to be thinking about when you're designing your micro-credential and considering its transcriptability and its applicability and opportunities for admission and transfer. So as I said, this is available in the report to aid everyone, and it's from the community, and it's positioned as more questions for schools and others to ask as they're going through in a methodical way to create micro-credentials. There were some sample design questions that emerged from the consultation and research, thinking about who is validating it. Is it from a recognized organization? Is it official, etc.? These are very important questions that a credential evaluator is sitting and thinking about right at the point of, we've received this document, what do we do with it? How do we build it into our practice? So again, other design questions that were raised at a thematic level, when thinking about a micro-credential, what is it that learners need to be able to know and do? What evidence would suffice to demonstrate they've achieved this learning? And should admission and transfer be considered at the foundational design stage, given the motivations to improve access to further education and beyond? Questions on my mind: will micro-credentials change the practice of assessment for admission and transfer? And what does all this mean for credential evaluators? So I go back to this diagram that I showed you earlier, because this is where the rubber hits, this is where it matters. This is where a micro-credential arrives at a higher education institution, and what do they do with it at all these multiple levels in order to help the people that it is intending to help, in order to help access and mobility. So without further ado, I'd like to pause and then turn us over to questions. Thank you very much.
All right, welcome back, everybody, and it's my pleasure to introduce Joanne Duclas to the live room. I see there's a lot of questions in the Q&A, so we're going to get to those in just a minute. Just as a general reminder, if you scroll to the bottom of this session description, you will find the link to the micro-credentials report. This report was published just earlier this week, and it's also available online in the BCCAT website. But if you want to download the report, you can find it right here at the bottom of the session. So welcome, Joanne. And I'm happy to start throwing out the questions that have been submitted so far. So the first question that was submitted this morning by Laura Bushi is, what is the sector-wide definition of micro-credentials?
So let me start by saying there's quite a section of the report that talks about this entire space. The reality is there isn't a sector-wide definition of micro-credentials. There are many attempts at this, and generally speaking, what I've done with the report is curate some of that findings for you from the extensive literature review and the environmental scan. And I've also, both through that work and through various interviews, as well as the national survey, provided for you what some of the common thematic characteristics and elements are for the definition. I think that there's a real opportunity here, and as you noticed from the presentation, there are some definitions that I think are really powerful. The State University of New York, for example, provides a really thoughtful, nuanced definition, and there are other examples that I can talk about today, should they come up.
Right. There was a sub-question to that, and the question was around how many people did you interview here in Canada and around the world?
So we had to take a multi approach, shall we say, to the research, and it was also within a certain defined budget. So we interviewed 8 experts from around the world and augmented that with extensive literature review, environmental scan, and our national bilingual survey, so that we could provide a rounded as well as nuanced perspective. And I certainly give acknowledgement to the colleagues that we talked to around the world in the report. And there are some fantastic experts who are active in various organizations, such as the Groningen Declaration Network. And some of those are folks that I talked to as well. The Groningen Declaration Network, my firm is in fact a participant, a formal participant. It's their word for member and signatory. It is an important organization that talks about ways to advance learner mobility through various things like credential and data portability. So the whole topic of micro-credentials is very much a topic that they are engaged with in their work. So some of the colleagues I spoke with also are from that organization, et cetera. So they're listed in the report under the acknowledgement. And if you have a follow-up question, I'm happy to speak to that.
All right. Lots more questions in the chat. Here's another one from Kathy Sidlicek. What different models are institutions exploring for designing micro-credentials?
One of the models that I think if you're interested, one of the sections of the report talks about both domestic as well as international exemplars. And so Algonquin College has done some good work in terms of developing a framework to guide their thinking around micro-credentials. I've already mentioned SUNY, but then there's also really interesting work, including in BC, and I was personally quite intrigued by the work that Thompson Rivers University has been doing with their building or accepting micro courses, shall we say, towards an undergraduate degree. So I think there's enough variety out there that I've curated in part in the report. There's also a really interesting study that's recently published back in, I think it was February, March, that was done by Don Present that looked at the what an institution might want to consider when they're developing micro-credentials, and he talks about the typology of opportunities that are out there around the world. So it is referenced in the study, and so you'll be able to access it. And I think it's another one that you might want to look at. I think one of the things that are really key when thinking about developing an institutional framework for micro-credentialing is to think about purpose and also potential purpose. If one of your motivations is to improve access to future studies as well as transition to work, or one or both, then I strongly urge in the design of your micro-credentials that you think about admissions and transferability, which means that having alignment with your quality assurance for your programs, whether that's internal, external, or both, is really important. And to bake in thinking about that ultimate motivation and purpose in your design. The other one that I would point to at the system level is the one that I've referenced in the presentation. It's the one that the New Zealand Quality Authority put together, the NZQA. There are in different parts of Canada, not all, credential qualification and qualification frameworks. What they did is they actually looked closely at micro-credentials. They have an approval process. They have a certain number of credentials, credits they require, because not all micro-credentials from New Zealand are in fact approved and part of the NZQA. But then what they did is they lined them up depending on what level they were at. Level is important, by the way. And I just want to put a pin on this further. In the report, I give examples where whether it's an industry micro-credential or it's an institutional micro-credential, depending on the level of learning and the learning outcomes achieved and credentialed, they actually can count at the graduate level even. So I think there's always this assumption that perhaps that micro-credentials are non-credit, that they don't relate to credit-based learning. That's not the case. And in fact, there's even some work coming out of Europe where, you know, with Dr. Oliver's work, where they talk about how micro-credentials are considered the credit-bearing, whereas badges are non-credit. Based on my research, badges are a subset of micro-credentials. And whether you call them micro-certifications or what have you, there's so much more than just a badge. And so thinking through, and yet a badge is also very powerful too. One of the schools in Canada is distributing 19,000 badges a year, and it's their academic faculty that in fact are distributing them as part of coursework. And so it seems logical to me that if a faculty member is distributing something like a badge that is evidence of achieving a learning outcome that's been assessed through a quality assured program, kind of seems weird that we're not looking at this more closely, even though it's not featuring it on a transcript, et cetera, when we're doing admissions and transfer credit assessment. I think this is particularly important when thinking about the fact that it is very hard for learners to provide things like course outlines, that even with the wonderful work going on in certain provinces, certainly in BC, with transfer credit equivalencies and so on, these represent another informational component to the work that could inform credential evaluation for admissions and transfer. So I just flagged these.
It's amazing. 19,000 badges and awards from one institution. That's incredible, and it'll be interesting to see how that reflects on the overall experience for the students and their overall achievement. Kind of related to that question, we have Lori Miller from UBC who submits the following question: have you looked at the micro-credentials within a Canadian military context? So in terms of mature students seeking admission and recognition as they go on to post-secondary after their military service?
Yeah, so we, as part of this, we didn't dig it. We did ask, by the way, and we did do the survey out to all the institutions across the country and ask them to participate. I am aware that, for example, there's a school out in the military school out in the east, as well as BCIT and others that are doing some really close work with the military for RPL to recognize that kind of experience. Through this particular research, none of those examples necessarily were provided, but I think you've touched on a really important area, and we do talk a little bit about the RPL piece and ties to industry here. Quite frankly, most of the micro-credentials that are coming out of institutions in Canada tend to be coming from continuing education divisions, often in partnership with industry. And some of those might have within them courses that are transcripted. There's a real opportunity here to do more, and also to do more with other external bodies, such as the military, where they have very thoughtful and rigorous programming to help their communities grow. We had one of the people I spoke with was with the Treasury Board, and they've done some really interesting work with competency assessment within the government for what they call a free agent program, and they actually give them what you might call a micro-credential. That's occurring totally outside of a recognized post-secondary institution, but it's following a very thoughtful and well-rounded and expert-informed framework for their proof of concept for these competencies. And so one would think, these are experiences that have been assessed through a thoughtful assessment process within our own government and industry, so that these people can move around freely in the government and not be held back. I myself am an example of someone who's done graduate work, but then also have gone into industry-specific HR training and received what you might call a micro-credential, and actually am formally certified as a psychometric assessor who can do formal assessment of people's competencies and skills that are relevant to leadership in the workplace. That was done outside of a recognized institution, but as someone who's done graduate work, I can tell you it was quite solid. So why wouldn't I want to be able to take a micro-credential from that experience? And should I go on for other studies, have it considered for the future? And we have other examples in so many other industries. That's just a flavor.
I've got another question here, and then the questions are coming in fast and furious. We have a question from Cassie Savoy from University Canada West. In your research, did you note any institutions who are using micro-credentials for PLAR, which is prior learning assessment recognition, if not for transfer credit?
So yes, there was an example in BC where they actually give specified number of credits for transfer, and they also look at it through their admission process. And it sounds similar to me, the way they described it, to what I saw in New Zealand. Frankly, even though we had 90 respondents, of which just over 80 were post-secondary institutions, there was only about 18 institutions that self-identified in this space. So I think there's it's an indicator, a proxy indicator in my mind, that there is room, but most reported they're not using it for admissions and not using it for transfer.
All right, we got a lot of questions that are coming in right now. I mentioned when we were in the green room that the questions seem to come very quickly at the end. So I will ask a question from Jason Colombo. Is transcripting a micro-credential a duplication of transcripting a course completion?
It depends on what makes up the micro-credential. If there's a course within a micro-credential that is transcripted, then you are quite right. Plus, it's also the nature of the document. The micro-credential is one would argue, a terminal credential for the learning experience. Within that is learning experiences that either could be fully non-credit, fully credit, a mix of both, have industry, etc. So there's some heavy lifting an institution needs to do, especially in academic and registrarial areas, to understand that. But the reality and how you want to transcript that. There was one example that was provided, and it was transcripted more like generified. Transfer credit is transcripted at the top, and it's not as helpful to assist with admissions and transfer. I think, though, that there's room for convening opportunities to discuss this further and come up with standards. I've raised it for, I know Jason knows this, there's a Transcript and Transcriptwide in the registrarial community. There's a working group that looks after it. There's academic colleagues that sit on that working group. And I suggested to them that micro-credentials be an important topic of a conversation, which I'm happy to help them with, to have with the community so that we can get at some of those details.
So I got a very interesting question here from Michelle Patterson from Vancouver Island University. Do you think complementary stacking will really be the future of post-secondary education? So is this era of rapid change and opportunity you talked about presupposing bigger changes to the traditional education models?
I personally think it's already here. We just don't call it. I'm a good example of that. I used myself earlier. I did an undergraduate degree and then graduate work, and then went on and did something, and it's a package of stuff that I present to the world. I do think complementary, as I call it, or others call it value added, is happening already, but there's some opportunity here to be more intentional.
All right, we got a couple more questions. There's a question from John Bryant, also from UBC. You mentioned TRU's initiative. Are there micro-credentials tied to specific TRU courses as transfer credit or through additional PLAR?
So I did not interview Thompson Rivers University directly. So the information in the report is based on published information. From what I understand, they're actually recognizing the micro courses from other parts of the world and counting them towards Thompson Rivers credentials. I think it's an excellent question, and I would invite our colleagues. You could even do a session with Thompson Rivers University to really drill down on the specifics of that. But that is why I mentioned it at the front end as a very intriguing other model that has more I think aligns really beautifully with the philosophy that is my understanding that TRU uses. And I think it's an important one that we should be paying attention to.
All right. I've got two final questions, but they're both kind of related. So I'm going to ask them. Shauna Rosloot from the Ministry of Advanced Education in Saskatchewan has the question: how is BC approaching a national framework for micro-credentials? And then just related to that, Laura Bushi is asking, would BC CAP be interested in creating a micro-credential registry that's similar to what New Zealand is doing? So maybe talk first a little bit about what is BC doing, what is BC's approach to developing a national framework for micro-credentials?
So I would never, ever speak upon behalf of a province. I think that that's a fantastic set of questions, and I think you should be directing those to BC CAT and Dr. Rob Fleming and Dr. Rob Adamowski, et cetera, and others. What I would say to you from what I've noticed in the research, and I'll tell you this, one of my other hats that I wear is I am helping to bring in the Aruk National Network. And what we're doing is we're working in partnership with institutions and organizations and hubs across the country in order to create a document exchange as well as a learner portal environment. There is lots of conversations that some of us are having about credential confusion. And so one of the things you'll see in the report are references to other jurisdictions that are engaging in creating credential registries. So an example is Credential Engine in the States, where their aspiration is to create a registry that can hold 750,000 of the different credentials that they see. I actually have sat and am sitting on a transfer credit working group looking at descriptor languages to help with data exchange related to that kind of credential work. And I'm meeting quite frequently with Credential Engine because of some of my other work, and I'm quite impressed with their work. The New Zealand one is also an excellent example. As they approve their micro-credentials, they are putting them in their registry so that they're clearly available. I think that this is a question that's bigger than one institution, bigger than one province. It's a question for Canada. We need to make sure that the Canadian higher education brand, if you will, and the interpretation of all the credentials coming out of Canada is robust. And I know that that's certainly a focus of CSIC and CMEC across Canada and around the world. Europe is looking at this space. So lots of good conversation with good people happening in various other venues. I'm sure that's going to occur in BC as well.
All right. So just to get back to the question by Laura from CNC, would BC Cat be interested? I don't know about BC Cat. I would say that the question might be better phrased as, would BC be interested in creating a micro-credential registry? I think Rob Fleming, if he were on this call, would have a much stronger opinion on that matter. I do think that there is a lot of interest from the province of BC on micro-credentials. And so whether that turns into a registry, I guess that story is still unfolding. There is one final question, and then we'll wrap it up. This is from Ian Affleck from the University of Fraser Valley. Are there particular micro-credential themes that industry sectors are asking for, such as banks or tourism? What are your thoughts on that?
So one of the objectives of the research was to look at the employer side. So how we went at it was, okay, you're a large employer as a school. Your school is producing micro-credentials. Are you using them in your hiring practices? And generally speaking, the feedback anecdotally that we've got back, and I would say this is an area for future research, is they're not using them for transfer credit, even though they're producing them, or admission, which is kind of interesting because it might be the same faculties that are delivering the learning. There is other organizations that have done very large studies on this space. We did not probe into it extensively on the employer side, but IBM does millions of micro-credentials, and I'm meeting with their lead in this space quite regularly. And Alex has said to me that, in fact, they have some very specific learnings that they need to make sure their IBM community has. And so they're building out their credentials, and the credentials cover off competencies in specific content areas, but also in areas such as leadership and communication as it's relevant for their work. So I think we see a lot of that kind of customization occurring, and that's what I'm hearing from the community, but I think there's room for even more research in that space.
All right. Well, I want to be respectful of the time. We are at the end of this session. Thank you very much, Joanne, for joining us this morning from Ontario, this afternoon for you. This has been really informative. Thank you to everybody who submitted questions into the chat. As always, this session will be made available at the end of the day through our YouTube channel, so feel free to pass that on to anybody who might be interested in learning more about micro-credentials. So thank you, and we will begin our next session starting at 11 a.m.
Thank you very much, Mike. Have a great day.